So next up, Sean Scantlebury, PhD student and research assistant at Leeds Beckett and S&C coach at Queen Ethelburgers, talking about the training and match exposure in youth sport athletes. So over to you, mate.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Rob, and thank you to Ben and Kev for letting me come and speak today. And thank you to Ben for using a photo of me dressed entirely in white with Ray Charles sunglasses on as my photo on that welcome page there. But training and match exposure in youth team sports, namely rugby, football, hockey and netball. A little bit of background on the athletes who were recruited into this research. They are participants in a school sport program where the school would recruit these athletes into the program, often via scholarship, and offer athletes the opportunity to increase the volume of their training by incorporating sports training into the curriculum or into the timetable. As you can see here, that's a list of the top 100 school sport programs in the UK, and if there's a top 100, it's pretty safe to assume that there's more than 100 of these school sport programs, each with multiple teams within the program. So there's a lot of athletes that are currently taking part in these school sport programs. So training and match exposure in youth team sports, why is it important? And it's because developing a youth athlete often feels like walking a tightrope, whereas if you fall off on one side and you have a lack of training stimulus, the athlete's at risk of a lack of preparation, not being able to meet the demands of the game, particularly during the most intense periods, as Dan mentioned earlier, and also a lack of development, as there's research to show that athletes who had a great exposure to training as a youth athlete developed a greater level of technical, tactical, and psychological skills in comparison to athletes who perhaps didn't train so much as a youth athlete. But it's too simplistic to just say that more is better, because then you run the risk of falling off the other side of the tightrope, and with an acute period of excessive training without recovery, you can have overuse injury, whereas a more chronic period of excessive training without incorporated recovery, you run the risk of overtraining and potentially burnout. But before we can sort of establish what is insufficient training and what is excessive training, we need to understand what these youth athletes are currently undergoing at the moment. So the athletes would come into school, they'd fill in a web-based questionnaire where they'd use 24 hours of recall to recall all activity that they'd completed both inside and outside of school the previous 24 hours, giving a duration and a perception of intensity using a Borg CR10 scale. And representative athletes in this research are defined as athletes who take part in the school sport program, but then also represent an academy side, for example, a county side or an international side. And you can see here that their training schedule is an amalgamation of training happening both inside of school and outside of school, where in general, they complete about 3 technical training sessions a week, 1 to 2 resistance training sessions, and 1 to 2 matches. In comparison, non-representative athletes, which are athletes who participate in the same school sport program, but perhaps represent an amateur club outside of school, they're not exposed to as much training outside of school as these representative athletes. So you can see that athletes who are currently playing at a higher standard are exposed to a greater training load outside of school in comparison to athletes who are currently playing at a lower standard. So once it's been established how frequently these athletes are training, it's then important to understand how hard these training sessions are. Now, I'm using representative athletes here as an example, but these findings do translate over to non-representative athletes as well. And you can see that club technical training sessions place the greatest load on these representative athletes and is the most demanding element of their training schedule. But when you break SRP training load down into its construct, or its construct of intensity, you can see that, as you might expect, match intensity is consistently perceived to be the most intense activity. And in fact, even resistance training is perceived to be at a greater intensity than club technical training. So you can start to see that a potential reason why these club technical training sessions are so demanding for the athlete is the duration. So going back to what Paddy was mentioning just before, during periods of a high match load, if a coach is looking to manipulate the training load to try and level off the training and reduce that variability so that training loads and match loads don't spike at the same time, a potential way to do that is just by reducing the duration of training. But that only works, and Paddy expertly set me up with this, if the school and the club work simultaneously and work in synergy with each other, because there's no point in an athlete going to a club training session, the coach reducing the durations, therefore reducing the load placed on the athlete going into school, and the school coach going, great, you had a lighter session yesterday, let's train really hard today, because that's going to negate the benefits of reducing the duration of the club technical training session. And that's one of the main, it's gone all blurry there, that's one of the main takeaways of this research, is that club coaches and school coaches, academy coaches, county coaches need to work in collaboration to make sure that the training goals are aligned. And periods of high intensity training, periods of high volume training, and periods of recovery are synchronized between each of the programs that the athlete engages in. Because athletes absolutely need periods of high intensity training to develop the physiological capabilities to be able to meet the demands, particularly during the most intensive periods, as Dan mentioned, and they absolutely need periods where there's multiple sessions within the week to develop the technical and tactical skills required to attain success within the sport. But they also need recovery implemented into that program as well, and the recovery needs to match up across the schedule. Because using representative athletes from January to February there as an example, you can see that on a weekly basis they undergo 3 technical training sessions, 1 resistance training session, and 2 matches, which seems like quite a manageable training load, but the context is extremely important there. Because, for example, if you have an athlete that plays a school game on the Wednesday, then on the Thursday, the school coach says, great, we played a match yesterday, here's a recovery session. Then that athlete then goes and plays and trains for their club later that evening, which are the most demanding elements of the training schedule, then comes into school on the Friday and the school coach goes, great, you had a recovery session yesterday, so we're going to increase the intensity of training today. Well, the athlete didn't actually get a chance to recover there. So not only is the athlete training in an unrecovered state on the Friday, they may be incapable to train at the intensity that the coach requires them to train at on the Friday due to impairments in neuromuscular function. And then the athlete may go and play a match at the weekend for their club side and is incapable of reaching their full performance or full capabilities because they're still suffering from residual fatigue because they haven't actually had a period of recovery following that match on the Wednesday. So you can start to see how it's really important to synchronize these periods of recovery so that the athlete has an opportunity to recover and optimize their development. And it's at this point where I'm sure all the club and school coaches sitting in the audience are thinking, well, we've invested a lot of time in these athletes and a lot of money in these athletes. We need them to be playing for us. But it's not just a case of this incorporated recovery being beneficial for the athlete. It could be mutually beneficial for the club coaches, the school coaches, and the player. And I've gotten an analogy to try and sort of sum that up. And it's called remember to go to the dry cleaners. So you buy a nice wedding suit, and you want the suit to look as nice as you possibly can have it on your wedding day. But then you get invited to a friend's birthday party, and you think, it's a formal dress occasion, you know what I'm going to do, I'm going to wear that wedding suit. So you do, and everyone compliments you on it and says you look really smart, and it goes down really well. But towards the end of the night, you dance a little bit too much, and you spill a little bit of red wine on there, and there's a little bit of a mark, and you think, it's not a big deal. I can get away with it. And you can. And a couple of weeks later, you get a job interview, and you think, that suit went down really well at that birthday party, so I'm going to give it another go. And you do, and you wear your suit, and it goes down really well, and once again, you're getting lots of compliments, and it's a big success. But if you're anything like me in a job interview, or even presenting, you'll be saturated with sweat by the end of it. So now, all of a sudden, your suit's got a red wine mark on it, you're saturating a bit of sweat, and that suit isn't as good as you need it to look on your wedding day. It's not as good as it could possibly be, because you forgot to go to the dry cleaners. So you forgot to give that suit a chance to repair and be recovered for the wedding day. So if you flip that round, I'm sure you've all worked it out by now, but the athlete is the wedding suit. The wedding day is an important fixture, such as a cup final, and the birthday party and the job interviews are fixtures which lead on the way to that cup final, and the dry cleaners is recovery. The coach must implement periods of recovery into the training schedule to make sure that when you need that player to be at their absolute best, the player can, because they're not suffering from residual fatigue and impairments in neuromuscular function, because research has shown that the accumulation of fatigue has impaired performance in youth team sports in Australian football, rugby, basketball, through reductions in speed, agility, and power, and also a reduction in GPS metrics such as total distance, high speed running, and time spent in higher heart rate zones. So you can see there that it's not just beneficial to incorporate recovery into the program for the athlete's development, but for the club coaches, the school coaches, the academy coaches, the international coaches, to get the best out of your player when you really need them to be at their best, incorporate some recovery. But the big question is, how do you know when your suit needs to go to the dry cleaners? And hopefully, Tom over here is going to shed some light on that. Thank you very much.